Welcome very much to our event today here at the Robert Bosch Foundation. My name is Henry Altaka. I'm Senior Vice President of the Foundation, and I'm only here because you're at our premises, and the most important people come after me, but I wanted to at least welcome you here, and thank you very much for coming to this conversation, Reimagining Development Cooperation and Pragmatic Pathways for Africa-German Relations. I'm very excited that we have this conversation here with such a distinguished group of experts and decision makers, and Olumide is going to introduce them more in detail, so I'm not going to bore you with their impressive CVs if you haven't seen them already, but I just wanted to say that I am very happy that we have this conversation on the future of African-German, African-European relations here, more or less a year after the Ministry of Economic Development has presented its Africa strategy, also here. And so there's a theme. So after the third, it's a tradition, after the third event. And back then, I think that we talked a lot about how COVID impacted African-European relations and how the invasion of Ukraine impacted international relations, specifically also with an impact on the African continent. And so I'm curious to hear what we are talking about today, because it's not like we are short of crises. The Robert Bosch Stiftung is, among other things, trying to increase evidence-based decision-making in Germany and in Europe in policy making, and as such, we are trying to work with think tanks as evidence creators. And APRI is one of our oldest partner in this portfolio, and we are very excited to work with them because one of the missions that they are having, very much aligns with ours, is to increase expertise on the African continent in Berlin, because it is, in this respect, Germany is still very much a developing country when it comes to understanding our neighbor in the south. And I know that APRI is trying to change that and is trying to change it by bringing African voices into the debate and not just have people who look like me talk about the continent, but people who actually live there and have the expertise on the ground. And I'm very much thinking that this is an important part of the conversation. But in addition to that, also us at the Foundation, we work on the African continent. We work on climate change issues. For example, we work on land and water use in mainly East Africa and the Horn. We work on migration questions, on inter-regional cooperation of migration movements. And we work on the peace program on locally led peace-building initiatives, mainly in West Africa and the wider Sahel region. But what I find even most interesting, I have to say, is that we work on the interconnectedness of those topics, because they're no longer silos just standing next to each other, but we are trying to talk about what impact does climate change have on the migration pattern of herders, which might then have an impact on conflict situations. What legal statutes have to change internationally to give climate refugees protection under the law that other refugees have. So these kind of questions we are dealing with and trying to see the interconnectedness, and always do it with local partners on the ground and use their intellectual expertise and their knowledge and their experience, and not do it here from our desks in rainy Berlin. And so I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, because I think it is an important step in these joint conversations for these joint challenges, to mix the expertises on both sides of the Mediterranean and challenge those challenges together. And I know that this is going to be the spirit of this conversation, with hopefully finding joint solutions at the end. So once again, thank you very much, and I hand over to Olumide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry, for the kind words of welcome, and of course for hosting us here today. Thanks. Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, Minister Schulze, distinguished guests here and online. On behalf of APRI, Africa Policy Research Institute, it is a great honor for me to welcome you to this conversation on reimagining development cooperation, pragmatic pathways for Africa-German relations. Today's discussion is the inaugural event in what will be an annual discussion series looking at Africa's place in the world. And we are delighted to be convening the first in the series with the strongest participation possible from the BMZ. Africa and Europe are neighbors. And while they are facing different challenges, there are real opportunities for complementary solutions. Recognizing and acting on them will require thinking out of the box beyond the ritualistic, well-rehearsed statements that often characterize the Europe-Africa relations. It is not hard to imagine the sorts of partnership that can be forged between two neighboring regions, one with a median age of 45 and a declining and shrinking labor force, and the other with a median age of 19 and a need to create jobs at an unprecedented scale for such a young population. Africa's youth dividend presents a unique advantage and opportunity. A vibrant, energetic workforce ready to contribute to the advancement not only of their continent, but of its neighboring continent and the world at large. Harnessing this demographic potential, coupled with the energy, innovation, and creativity that is seen every day on the streets of African cities, can drive solutions that transcend borders. These, however, will require a perspective that does not fall back into the old migration utilitarianism, where people are reduced to their labor and remittances, often on both sides, so not only in the receiving country, but also on the sending country. Needless to say, in the current climate across Europe, such a reductionist perspective is bound to fall flat, especially in the eyes of the much sought after, highly skilled labor. Besides, what and where the youngest populations in the world learns, works, consumes, creates, and aspires to will shape the future, and not just in Africa and Europe, but in the world at large. We need to be able to come together to think about solutions and possibilities that do not just transcend borders, but also the present moment. Beyond the abundance of talent, resourcefulness, and creativity, Africa is also a continent with abundance of the natural resources that Europe and the world need at this critical time of transitioning energy and economy. For decades, Africans have been looking for ways to reduce the exploitation of unprocessed natural resources from the continent. Indeed, primary products are still the biggest exports of Africa to Europe. And we have to remember that collectively as a continent, Europe is still the biggest trading partner of Africa. So that means that when Africa exports minerals and primary products, they mostly come to Europe. Now, as the world needs more of the resources that Africa has, African countries are looking for new, innovative partnerships that can support them to realize their potential of becoming a hub for production, whether in manufacturing the intermediate goods that are needed here in Germany and Europe, or in the global energy transition that Germany and Europe have committed to. It really is not that hard to imagine that partnerships based on fairer trade agreements and investment agreements can offer both continents immense advantages. These current moments, the current geopolitics, the war in Europe, the demographic pressures, and the climate crisis conspire in demanding a break with old wisdom and policy practice. German-Africa relations provide a key case for new, more reflexive, more integrated approaches that are both more holistically informed, historically informed, and at the same time, more strategically and future-oriented. Doing so, I dare say, could be the hallmark of what could be termed a reflexive feminist development policy. As we seek further strengthening of the relationship, we also need to acknowledge, however, that there are challenges to such cooperation. We cannot ignore the changing tide in political rhetoric in parts of Europe, where some are increasingly turning inwards. On the African continent, we see democratic fabric being tested in some countries. We also see African countries actively renegotiating their relationships with the world, and not necessarily with a view towards Europe. We must navigate these complexities to ensure that our shared goals of development and progress remain steadfast in the face of increasing polarization and far-right ascendancy across Europe, an ascendancy that threatens to close crucial policy windows needed to address the interlinked crisis of demography, democracy, and ecology. A transformed and transformative German-Africa relations is not just a key requirement for tackling these issues, but also allows for a policy showcase on how to leave received wisdom behind and dare to do things differently. There's a great need to collectively work towards reinforcing governance structures that stand the test of time on both sides, ensuring stability and prosperity for both regions. As we do this, we also need to be careful, knowing that good intentions do not always produce good results. We are going to be discussing some of these issues today. We want to discuss how to leverage the strengths of both Germany and African countries and how to concretely foster a partnership that goes beyond traditional notions of development cooperation. But before all of that, it is my great honor and pleasure to invite to the podium for the keynote address the Federal Minister for Economic Development and Cooperation. Please, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, can development cooperation move the world forward? Is it the right instrument to achieve progress? I have been asked that question many times in the last few weeks, given the many crises in the world and not least the strains on public budgets. My answer is really clear. It is yes. It is precisely these global and regional crises that make development cooperation more important than ever. So development cooperation helps to protect people from poverty and hunger. It supports countries in coping with the damage inflicted by climate change. And it promotes education and decent work, enabling societies to set themselves on the road to more prosperity in a way that is lasting. Another question I'm often asked is, do we need to reimagine our development cooperation with Africa? And again, my answer is clear. I say no. We don't need to reimagine it, but we need to refocus it using our imagination. And that is what my ministry's new Africa strategy, published exactly 1 year ago, sets out to do. It puts our cooperation on a new footing, one of respect and reciprocity. What exactly do I mean by that? I mean recognizing that Africa is a dynamic continent, that it is no longer dependent solely on Europe as its partner. Instead, we Europeans need Africa as our partner. We must tackle global transformation together and support others in crises. And that is what our moral value tells us, and that's what our strategic interest tells us too. Take stability. It is both a moral value and at the same time in our own strategic interest. Germany and Europe can only be as stable as the world around them. So the Sahel region provides a case in point. As president of the Sahel Alliance, I visit the region often. And when I talk to decision makers, to vocational students, to fishing communities and displaced people, as I recently did in Mauritania, I get a real sense of how much climate change, demographic change, and the spread of autocracy is impacting the region. Often people have no job prospects, extreme weather events leave them struggling just to survive, and all that with really little social protection. A situation like that is really a fertile ground for extremists. And so I have made the decision, Germany will continue to engage in development cooperation with the Sahel region, even though in various countries regimes have now come to power through military coups. Where needed, we will work with non-governmental organizations at community level without government involvement. The aim is to support the people and to make sure that autocracy and extremism do not spill over into other countries in the Sahel and on the coast. That can only be achieved in cooperation with each other by working together even more intensively with the surrounding countries. We in Europe rely on the stability of our neighboring continent because the challenges of today can only be tackled in partnership with Africa. Europe is, to put it rather bluntly, an aging continent that is in the process of redefining itself. Africa, on the other hand, is a young, a growing continent that will define the future. A smart structural policy could use this situation to develop shared opportunities for healthy food for all, for sustainable energy supply and decent work. And let us look a little bit closer at the last example, work. In many African countries, the local labor market is struggling to provide jobs for a growing population. And in many European countries, including Germany, there is a growing skills shortage. And that is why we are aiming for closer cooperation. For example, Germany and Morocco have agreed to work together more closely on migration. When I leave today's event, I will be setting off on a visit to Morocco, and I will be opening one of our centers for migration and development in Rabat. And these centers have been set up with German funding in 9 partner countries, 5 of them in Africa. They provide local people with information on regular migration pathways to Germany, to Europe, or to other countries within the region. And they can point people to training opportunities that will give them the skills they need to find work either locally or in another country. And in all this, my ministry works closely with our partner countries to prevent a brain drain of the skilled workers they so badly need. So contrary to what many think, most of the people prefer to find work within their region, close to home, and not in Europe. And that's not just because of the weather here. Here in Germany, half of the population is over 45. In Africa, half of the population is aged below 19. Where there are young people, societies are more dynamic, there are ideas and new opportunities. I got a sense of that last November when 35 young entrepreneurs from 16 African countries took part on an event held by my ministry in connection with the Compact with Africa Summit. The event was entitled Shaping Future with Africa, Young Entrepreneurship as Key to a Just Transition. The energy and confidence of these young entrepreneurs was really incredible. They provide my ministry with precise recommendations on how to promote sustainable, green entrepreneurship, and they also voiced expectations for their own government. These young entrepreneurs are both imaginative and pragmatic when it comes to developing tailor-made solutions to their own challenges. So talking to them showed me again how important it is for us to really listen closely. In German development cooperation, our role is not to know everything better. Our role is to offer partnership so that our partner countries can make full use of their own problem-solving capacities. And that brings to another of our values, and that is very important to me, respect. A respectful partnership means that Germany must confront its own colonial history. At the Development Ministry, we are taking a very critical look at our work. We have called in outside experts to help us identify where colonialist attitudes still persist in our mindset and in our work, and to develop ideas on how to overcome it. Of course, it is not only Germany and Europe that want to work closely with Africa. African countries have some attractive alternatives available to them, often in the shape of countries that, sadly, do not share our democratic values. So we, in Germany, in Europe, need to work hard to maintain a good partnership with African countries. Because one thing is clear, nothing can be achieved without Africa. That is why African countries are quite rightly demanding equal standing on the international stage. It is a demand I fully support. Last year, the African Union achieved a significant step in becoming a member of the G20. The next step is for Africa to have permanent representation on the UN Security Council. It has the backing of the German government in that. So Africa needs a place at the table. That's not only right because it is right, it is also necessary. Africa has a key role to play in transforming the global economic system to make it socially just. And that was the clear message from the African Climate Summit in September. In the summit's declaration, the countries outlined their ambition to expand renewable energies. And at the same time, they clearly called on the world community to move forward on debt relief, the reform of the international financial architecture, and fair taxation of greenhouse gas emissions. State secretaries from the Development Ministry and the Federal Foreign Office attended the event on Germany's behalf. All of them reported back to me on the general sense of that change is on the way. The self-confidence and constructive approach shown by African stakeholders make me really hopeful that together we will be able to overcome the immense challenges that lie ahead. We need you, and thank you for working with us. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude. The answer is not less international cooperation, but more, much more. And so, that note, I will close with a wish for a good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much once again, Minister, for your address. I picked a few things from there. One of them is respect, which is important. The second one is that the ministry is looking critically at the way it works, which is always a great thing to hear. Two things stuck with me, though, as you were speaking. One of them is the need for Germany to refocus development cooperation. And the second is the last line, which you said just now. The answer is not less international cooperation, but more, much more. So how to refocus that, Germany's development cooperation on the one hand, and how to increase international partnerships on the other, is what we want to try and talk about on this panel today. I'm not going to go into a very long reading of profiles. We don't have time for that. And you have, on where you're sitting, programs with the profile of each of the persons on the panel. But what I'm going to do is to mention very briefly who they are. They're a distinguished panel, and I'm really happy and lucky to have them here with me today. From the BMZ, at the end over there, we have Director Birgit Pickel. Birgit is the Director General for Africa at the BMZ. Thank you for joining us, Birgit. I was hoping I wouldn't have to say that. We should clap, but thanks for that. Beside her, we have, with a national and continental perspective, we have Honorable Bogolo Kenewendo, who is joining us from Botswana. Bogolo is former Cabinet Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry of Botswana, and is currently UN Climate Change High-Level Champion Special Advisor and Africa Director. Thank you for joining us, Bogolo. And we'll round off the distinguished panel with a multilateral perspective anchored by Director Ahuna Ezekonwa. Ahuna is UNDP's Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa. And I know you have an extremely busy schedule, and I know you've been traveling a lot recently, so I'm really grateful that you joined us today. Thank you so much. As I noted earlier, that's the profile, and you have the longer ones in all of the CV. Housekeeping first. Birgit has to leave slightly earlier, so we're going to reshape the discussion a little bit. We were going to have about 2 or 3 rounds of questions and then go to Q&A time, but instead we're going to start with one and see where we get to. If we have good time, we'll do a second round. If we don't, then we'll do a Q&A and then come back for a reflection from the panelists, starting with Birgit, and then we'll do a bit more after that. That works? Those in the room, questions, microphone. Those online, there's a thing that is going to pop up on your screen where you can scan something, and then you type something, and then I get the questions on this thing here. So I'm going to start with you, Bogolo. So you're a keen observer of development cooperation, but also of international relations, and you were Minister for Trade and Investment. You obviously had interactions with donor partners. You had interactions with, foreign affairs and foreign ministers. And also in your current role, you of course also have interactions with donors and partners, multilateral, bilateral philanthropists. Given all you've been seeing, given discussions you'll be privy to, what today does development mean for Africa?
All right, thank you very much, and good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I was sort of hoping that you would get started, since you have to leave. But it's okay. There's a really interesting concept that the minister mentioned, and that's where I really want to get started, around the thought of decolonizing international cooperation. What does that look like? And I think just off of your talk, some of the first thoughts that come to me in how do we decolonize international cooperation or the development agenda is by first removing this very hard and fast rule of there's a global north, there's a global south, that there's developed and there's developing. And I think this in itself has kept us in a very colonial thinking of how exactly can we cooperate with each other. And I say that in particular because we are still stuck in thinking about Africa, and I've been to Germany a few times in the last couple of years, and one very memorable example of the thought or thinking around cooperation, and I'm not saying it was a government thought necessarily, was where one was giving an example of how they could work with Africa, and they were talking about how do we disburse $20 to Africans. And I thought that is primarily the problem. You're thinking about Africa in a micro perspective. It's many countries, and we have cosmopolitan cities, we have industries, we have education. We have to think bigger about our cooperation with the continent, even from government, philanthropic perspective and business perspective. Think bigger about our relations, not only micro and boxing the continent into what used to be pushed in the 90s around the needs of cooperation. And so in decolonizing international cooperation, it goes back to just that separation. If we remove that separation and really think about our mutual needs, we think about mutual benefits, and to some extent look at what has been long argued as insurance international cooperation, which means act now before a disaster happens, because we do not know the cost of the disaster at a later point. So the level of cooperation as it should now, from my experience and looking at the crises we've experienced and potential crises that are about to come, because that's what international cooperation is supposed to do, to create a buffer for those. I believe that it has to be based on respect, on mutual cooperation, mutual benefit, and in the end, 3 principles of: do we have the right institution? Is the institution responding to that mutual cooperation, respect, mutual need, mutual benefit? Do we have the right ideas around what mutual benefit is? And lastly, do we have the right interest that channel and guide what our ambitions look like? So it's those 3 points that I can add on later, Olumide.
Thank you very much. I want to take off where you landed, which is interests. And I want to turn this now to Birgit from the BMZ. So the BMZ's Africa strategy was unveiled at almost a day to the day today, right? Last year? Yeah. And some stakeholders within Germany, I remember that shortly after that, there was quite a few articles written about what I'm going to talk about now. There was a demand that Germany's development cooperation should maybe more openly and more explicitly state what is in Germany's interest. In other words, it should defend Germany's commercial as well as foreign policy interests. I'm wondering what the BMZ thinks of that, because I think this is going to keep coming back. And my feeling is, given the current politics, given the fiscal situation in Germany, given the fiscal situation in Europe, given the politics we're seeing here in Germany, but also across the continent, it's going to keep coming back. What do you say to that?
Well, we think there's a very clear answer to that. We don't see these interests as opposites. We think international cooperation, the minister said it clearly, is really at the heart of our different fields, policy fields in Germany. We are all working internationally in the different fields, and we need to bring all of this together. So there is a deep interconnection between foreign policy, economic policy, development, scientific research, and so on. So we need to think these things together, and we have joint interests here in Germany and also at the international level. I think, why do I say, do we have an interest in and a need for international cooperation? It's been said before, this world is undergoing a dramatic change, and at a speed, I believe, that is maybe surprising to many of us, to all of us. I'm just referring to, the situation here in Europe, but also on the African continent. Look at the Sahel region. I mean, what has happened there and the speed at which we see change there has maybe been surprising, but to others not, because they have seen the underlying issues in the past. So again, we have an interest to stay engaged in the various worldwide, but particularly in Africa, in all its diversity. Maybe another point I want to make, we talk about Africa, you made reference to it as well. We're looking at different countries in all their diversity, and I think responding very flexibly with our own interests, whether they're economic, foreign affairs, development, scientific research, environmental climate, to that diversity with our development cooperation and the different instruments we have is the way to go. And then we can also manage to bring together different interests and address them. When there are interests, we need to talk about them and see how we can make them mutually beneficial. mutually beneficial that starts here in Germany, but particularly also with our African partners at the continental level. We are cooperating really, really closely with the African Union at the regional level, and then with the up to now still 33 countries where we have strong bilateral partnerships on the continent, but also beyond those countries. We all know Africa's political and economic weight is growing. So there is, and we know Africa has a menu to choose from in terms of partners. Europe remains, you said it, the largest trading partner. That's still the case. But the menu is getting bigger in terms of trade relations, in terms of scientific cooperation, and so on. So we need, in the end, with our own interests, make attractive offers to our partner countries. And I believe that development cooperation with a full range of instruments from government to government cooperation, civil society to civil society cooperation, research institutions, and so on, can really respond to these different needs. In our Africa strategy, you mentioned the anniversary. It's actually really been a year, which is quite incredible that it's already been a year when we published it. We are offering such a partnership based on respect and reciprocity. The minister has already mentioned it herself. Let me give a couple of examples where we think, where we are maybe moving in the right direction and putting this into practice, because we can talk theory about interests and all of that, but in the end it comes down to cooperation. We have been guided by, for example, the Africa Climate Summit and the results also mentioned already here, and the strong statement for a transformation of climate and energy systems on the continent, also taking into consideration the huge issue of access to energy. We all know 600 million people on the continent do not have access, and also energy security. Taking all of that into consideration, we have been working as Germany, but also as Europe under the African EU Green Energy Initiative on supporting the energy transition on the continent. And maybe one of the good examples on how we do that is the Just Energy Transition Partnerships in, for example, Senegal, which is already only starting, and in South Africa, which has been going on for some time. This is a platform where government, private sector, bilateral, multilateral actors come together and discuss in how in a specific country context that energy transition can be managed. And it's a lot about interest, and it's not always the same interests. So you need to find joint solutions so that all partners can actually come in and invest. But I think it's exactly those partnerships that demonstrate how to work together in a way that reflects maybe the international discussion in 2020. It's 2024, not 20. I wanted to say 2023. So I just wanted to give that as an example of how we can come together and discuss interests, goals, objectives, and actually outcomes, because in the end, it's about improving energy systems and delivering energy, hopefully clean energy, to the people that don't have access yet. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. I'm also still getting used to the 2024 thing, so it's okay. Ahona, I want to come to you for a bit of geopolitics and multilateralism. So the BMZ strategy, which the minister talked about and which Birgit already spoke about now, states that the ministry would implement the strategy in partnership with multilateral organizations to achieve a transformative impact. This, for me, sort of shows that the ministry puts a strong emphasis on multilateralism, which is great, and also African countries do that. UNDP is one of the largest multilateral development agencies. Could you speak about how the UNDP approaches development cooperation, or do you even call it that? Especially given the current geopolitical climate, because you're also working within this current climate.
Thank you so very much, and great to be back here. I really liked the strategy, and I was happy that I was a small part of it, the conversation last year. And I liked it for various reasons. I think the work on the narrative, I could see that there had been a very thoughtful process to get the positioning right. And I don't think this is to be taken for granted. And listening to you, Minister, I was saying to myself, I could have delivered that speech. So there was nothing that you said in the speech that I would not myself as an African say. But, you know, this conversation is difficult for me because it's difficult for me to make it professional because it's personal. You know, growing up in the 60s in my country, Nigeria, is when I was born, so I'm kind of a post-colonial child, but I have grown up with a colonial lens on my life. I have grown up with a slavery lens on my life. I've grown up with an apartheid lens on my life. And I've grown up with the concepts that have consistently put me as lesser than others. You know, you remember when development cooperation was branded as third world countries, developing countries, we kind of moved from third world. I remember the days when we were studying and we were talking about third world countries and third world citizens. That's what some of us have lived. And I joined the multilateral system not to carry out a profession in multilateralism, but actually to fight for my own liberation. This is why it's difficult to just simply speak as you're expecting me to speak, because then I have become a critic from the inside of the multilateral system and of development cooperation and international cooperation as a whole. Because, Minister, I think, yes, maybe it's not about reimagining it, but it's also, for me, not about refocusing it. It's about uprooting and disrupting it. Because if we can't talk about the future of international cooperation or development cooperation without looking at the history. This space has always been characterized as help, charity. That's the origins of it. And when you grow up with the concept of my mission is to go help those people, that always cancels out respect. It always cancels out dignity. And it cancels out agency. You find that with the best will in the world, and some of the intentions are quite good, and actually the positions that you've taken in the strategy and the minister's speech this afternoon, I would ask myself, how many Germans would make the same statement or align with it? How many Germans believe that this is what development cooperation is all about? Because on the ground, what we see is a constant diminishing of people's agency in the name of development cooperation, mostly unintentional. It's not, I wouldn't say that you start off that being the intention, but because of the nature and the branding and the power relations that underpin this, it invariably wipes out the agency, the dignity, the respect. Because it presumes that the person on the other end is in the situation that they are because they lack values, they're lazy, perhaps, they're not intelligent enough to liberate themselves from the conditions that they face. We are better than them. And it doesn't even matter what color you are or what country you come from. The DNA of this thing we call development cooperation and the way we have positioned it creates this notion of us and them. And them are always the ones we're going out there to help. And sometimes as an African, I even wonder how many people in the developed world need Africa to remain poor so that there is a place to save. What is the value of a continent like Africa to people who need saving of a different kind in the developed world, in the affluent world? What is the value of Africa? If you think we've been 5 decades in development on the continent and it's not better, not necessarily. Is there an hidden agenda, perhaps not even intentional, that requires a place like Africa to remain a subject? Therefore, the continuing objectivization of the region. And I'm not answering your question, but I think it's important that we move ourselves into that region of understanding why we need to overhaul this and why it is important for human existence, human dignity, for honesty. Last year we talked about honesty when we discussed the strategy. And I have a feeling that the world that offers development assistance has continued to not allow itself to be honest in really understanding the positioning that is there. That is why today people ask, why are you going to help those people? Why are you putting that money there? Because there is this lack of understanding that is truly about cooperation, about the things that you spoke about, Minister. So I think that the starting point for us has to be this understanding that human beings are probably all equal, irrespective of where they are positioned. You know, and I end with this. I had the privilege as a young woman from Africa in my early 20s of touring Europe. It was a very unique opportunity offered to a few of us who had just graduated from college from the continent of Africa to come and have an exchange with European youth. We went across this continent. And one thing that was a big surprise for all of us from the other side was how alike we were as young people when we exchanged with European youth who we had always envied because we thought they had everything that we longed to have. And there we were exchanging with them and hearing that their lives were not perfect, despite having every material thing that they needed, that they had deep sadness, that they had issues, that they, in fact, that they envied us. There was a certain mutuality there. And it set me off on the path that I ended up on, which is that I'm not less. They are not more, but they are also not less. That humanity, fundamentally, is the same. We may have different expressions of it. And so geopolitics, inclusion, equality, all of the things that we preach in Philippians. And sometimes I feel a certain amount of anger towards the African constituencies, because there's also an acceptance and a tolerance of being almost the one of accepting this help or this thing as help, and constantly saying, let our partners come and help us. Hell no. You're in the position to take control of your countries and to do what you have to do for the benefit of your people, utilizing your resources, which is in abundance, as you said at the opening. But that you disregard all of that and you invest so much in the partnership of help. So there is also the need for a rethinking on the Africa side and a repositioning of this whole cooperation and partnership in terms of what it should be about. Sorry, I went on for too long.
No, I think you went on for just the right amount of time. And just to let you know, I'm also getting pinged here that online, the thumbs up as you were speaking. And this might not have been the question I asked, but that was the answer we all needed. So thank you so much. I want to see whether there are questions in the room. Right now, does anyone have questions, thoughts, comments? Because I know that Birgit has to go, so I'm sort of trying to see whether you have any question for her before I say she should. Huh? Some minutes. Yeah. One of you.
My question is about we heard about the need to take account of European and German history and responsibility. So my question is, what about taking responsibility for collateral damage caused by past German development assistance itself? So in the light of looking back at what we would now say are maybe, as we have just heard, outmoded ideas about how development is practiced, what would you identify as the most urgent interventions needed to really reassess and maybe also look at ways of, undoing past, let's say, questionable actions? Since you talked about a new footing for partnership, wouldn't it be necessary to reset by looking back to then be able to forge that new future you talked about? And which policy areas, which modes of engagement would you say are most in need of changing to achieve that? Thank you.
Any other question? Yes, Dina. Please, sorry, I didn't say it earlier. Mention your name and where you are representing.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dina Fakusa from the Robert Bosch Foundation. I'm still not sure I really understand. So how should development cooperation look like in order to reflect that spirit of respect, of uprooting, this idea of help? I don't think I really understand. Really, I mean, are we talking about having maybe investments instead of the programs that are being implemented by the ministry, by the GIZ? So if you can become a bit more concrete in order to better understand really how this can be revamped, development cooperation, to reflect that spirit. Thank you very much.
Hello, Lauren Johnston, University of Sydney. I'm a China-Africa scholar. Just to throw in a devil's advocate question on the theme of the last question and the presentations, do you think China's refusal to give aid relief or debt relief from the loans it's given for particular projects is in this theme of not giving help, or is against the theme? Is it actually in the spirit of what you're talking about, which is you've taken this loan, it was agreed it should be paid back, or should they be giving debt relief? How does that context fit into this theme?
Thank you. I'm going to let the panel respond now. I'll start with Birgit, because there was a question directed specifically at you, and then I'll go to Ahona, because you also had a question directed at you. And then, Bogolo, do you want to take the China question? Yeah.
Let me start with the first question. I think the minister briefly touched on it. What we do and what we set out was a new policy document on how we want to work together with the African continent in the field of development cooperation makes makes the case that we, even though we don't have all the answers yet, and that is true even a year later, we want to start addressing the issue of the colonial past and how we've been working together in the past. And we want to do that, and we've started the process also in the ministry. How do we want to do this? I think first of all, and often this is a good recipe, I think, we want to do this by start asking questions. And questions with regard to what's good and maybe what's not so good. Where do we need to change and where do we not need to change? Because I believe that in this vast area of development cooperation, I mean, it's a huge field. The many, I mentioned it earlier, approaches, instruments, actors, partners, and so we have. Maybe there are things where we say this belongs to the past, and maybe there are areas where we say this is actually a good basis for a cooperation based on mutual interests between Germany and country X and on the African continent. So I think that kind of analysis is what we want to do, and we hope that it takes us forward and helps us to also, look back and look forward at the same time. Because I think the basic notion that international cooperation, however it is shaped, remains more relevant than ever, particularly for a country like Germany that is heavily interconnected and depends on international trade, partnerships, and so on, remains very, very valid from my perspective. The question on, and I just touch it briefly on, this is a very fundamental issue. If a notion of help remains at the core of cooperation, maybe there's a problem. I would say we could also have the thesis that if we manage as partners, Germany and South Africa, Nigeria, Morocco, whatever country we take, to discuss where are areas of cooperation where we want to work together. In the strategy, we set out 6 focal areas, including sustainable economic development, jobs. There's the area of addressing hunger, inequality, agricultural transformation, social protection. There's the area of gender equality. There's the area of governance, rule of law, human rights, peace and security, and health. Those are the 6 areas which we set out in the strategy. Now, this is a broad menu, really, to work from, and it's not completely exclusive. So I'm convinced that if we sit together with partners, including multilateral partners, other bilaterals, our European member states and Commission, and jointly discuss where are the areas where we want to work together and how do we structure cooperation, we can do that in a way which is adequate in 2024 and moves beyond an area of charity, a notion of charity and help. So this is how we want to work. I mentioned the Just Energy Transition Partnerships before. There are other examples. We have a German company which is quite well known, BioNTech. They just invested from their own funds in Rwanda for vaccine production. No development cooperation, no government money involved, anything. But then we were asked by the Rwandan government, can you support us in working on the ecosystem, regulation, skills development, and all of that? And we said, yes, we can do that. So we respond really to an ask from a government, and that links up to a private sector investment. Maybe this is a good example on how it could work in the future. And there are many, many others. But and if there are bad examples, bring them up and we discuss them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ahuna, the big question on what to do if we don't want development cooperation?
Be good to hear from the audience as well. I'm sure
that's
here
going to be the
we
next
have,
round, of course.
we have a real minds here. I think every development entity should put their programs to test as to, and we're starting to do this in UNDP. This project you're designing, does it reinforce or does it diminish the agency of the people and the states? That's one. Then I think there needs to be honesty around whether your programs, your national development cooperation have economic and national interests, whether it's on the basis of your national interest. In other words, don't use aid as a front for achieving larger economic interest or political interest. I think there's a lot of that happening, and that's distorting into the development cooperation space, where you have this politicization of that whole space. If there's politics involved, face it, we're here because we have this other interest. But often the Africa constituency is made to believe that this is aid, which is then why a whole string of conditions come with it that are not necessarily eventually benefiting the country. I think investing in ways that don't create dependency, but rather liberate the economies of the countries. And I'll give an example. We have fostered development cooperation on the basis of African countries exporting raw materials for industrialization or elsewhere and job creation elsewhere. And it's been a fight on the Africa side to see, if I'm producing cocoa, why can't you deal with me at a trade level if I actually process my cocoa at home? I struggle with the fact that this is even an issue, or that it should become a question in the way countries relate to Africa. That they get tariffed left, right, and center the moment you start to add value to your produce. And then you tell me you're interested in job creation and that you want to stop migration. If those industries are not in Côte d'Ivoire, Ivorians will go where the jobs are being created, and it's in whichever country is taking those raw materials, right? So how do you invest without this contradiction? On one hand, we're providing aid. On the other hand, we're not really encouraging the sectors of the economy that can make that country independent of aid. So growing the economies, growing the opportunity for jobs. And then I think this notion of focusing on ODA, what we could just talk about, ODA as a de-risking facility. Because we know that aid has never developed any country in the world. So if you have development aid or budget, can you reorient it so that it is creating the conditions for other economies to come on board and therefore be able to dynamize these economies rather than projectized an end in themselves rather than a means, right? So I think the de-risking component is a big part of the future. We're talking now, for instance, of the explosion of talent on the continent, particularly crowding in digital. Africa is where the future of development will be determined. Many of us say that. Because right now you've got a continent, a region developing at the same time that we have new technologies, that we have digital, that we have incredible knowledge and experience all over. So if aid is applied to de-risking the environment that then liberates this creative energy in the private sector, in the youth population, that would make all the difference. If it creates opportunities for Africa to trade within itself, AFCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, has just been launched. And we know, just like in Europe, the European Union has this incredible experience of what regional integration means to the prosperity of the people. Africa now has a chance to recreate that. How is aid dynamizing that space?
I was checking quickly if more thumbs were coming up. Thank you. Yes, please.
Before I respond to the devil's advocate question, I think we, in coming up with new strategies for how we deal with Africa, we have to think about, well, what is development? Well, what does development mean? How do we measure development? And I recall there was the Sarkozy Commission at some point that said we have to do a paradigm shift from economic production to impact on livelihoods. And even with that commission, they were unable to define what impact on livelihoods at that time meant, what development quite quantitatively looked like. And so I want to challenge the scholars in the room to go back to reimagining what development actually looks like. What do we mean when we say development cooperation? What works for the continent and what doesn't when we go back to that principle of mutual benefit? And so from that point of mutual benefit, FOCAC operates on just that. I remember the tagline of the second FOCAC meeting was mutually beneficial cooperation. And the question here is China operating on respect and mutual cooperation necessarily, if we look at debt? And fortunately for you, I actually wrote an article on this. But internet hasn't been connecting. That's what I've been trying to do to retrieve that said article. The title was something about Africa-China relations. I'll look for it and I'll bring it up.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes, and
we'll
you will share it. But I want to give you quick figures that I have retrieved. So contrary to popular belief, Africa debt from China only constitutes 12% of the entire continent. But of course, when we look much more granular to countries like Zambia, China is the greatest lender to Zambia. And we are looking at the over 46 billion worth of debt. And they've been in negotiations now to restructure about 6.3 billion of that debt. And I can tell you that it was announced by France, China, and many other lenders for Zambia in particular, if we just hone into that, that China is actively restructuring Zambia's debt. So it is not that, again, to a devil's advocate question, it is not that China hasn't come to the table when it comes to debt restructuring or when it comes to writing off several loans. And to further substantiate my point, as if I'm on a debating stage, that's because you asked that question. I wanted to bring up as well that I think the Exim Bank of China has also suspended well over $1.3 billion worth of debt in 2020. That was due to expire in 2020. And we have seen well over 16 African countries have that debt cancelled. Botswana was one of them. For Botswana, it's much smaller. I think it was maybe $30 million. It wasn't a lot because, again, we have very stringent macroeconomic policies and how we borrow. So it is not the conversation, as we usually put it in relation to China, always comes off as if it is very dire in African countries in comparison to how African countries actually relate to MDBs. Now, this is really where we also need to zone in when we talk about global financial infrastructure and the reforms that need to happen, and I know you have to go. But this is part of your cooperation as board members of the MDBs to really call to the attention that is needed in first capitalizing, again, the poverty reduction fund, yes, and to also ensure that we are able to have extra concessional lending, in particular relation to the just transition. And I say extra concessional because, one, the loss and damage fund only got $700 million this year. The need is well over $1.3 trillion. We celebrate small wins, but we need a lot more. And while we're waiting for all these funds to operate adequately, we need for MDBs to also recognize that developing countries are at fiscal pressures because of working with adaptation and resilience financing from their own budgets that are already tight and already limited by trading issues of you cannot export value-added products, and therefore you cannot attract the right economic and revenue from your own products because there's no value. So that dichotomy that operates in the economy and is supported by the distorted global financial infrastructure needs to be fixed in order for us to see the right economic development and economic agency in Africa. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Birgit has to go.
I'm just saying
yes.
Thank you very much, and there are colleagues in the room from BMZ listening in, so if there are further messages, they're all taken note of. Thank you very much, and have a good discussion.
Thank you. So I'm beginning to think that every panel discussion should have questions immediately after the first round of questions, like open it up to the public, because we actually get some interesting questions that spark debates in different directions. So thank you very much for the contribution so far. Are there other questions in the room? Well, our time is almost up. Your name and where you're from.
I was particularly concerned a little bit that the minister and her colleague did not really mention the nexus of security and development. It was mentioned that, you know, the pie is growing bigger because there are other actors. China was mentioned already there, and they also have interests. So my question really is this old nexus still true, that there is no development without security and there's no security without development? How is that being discussed, particularly on the continent? Thank you.
Thank you. There was a hand up there, yes.
Remco van der Pas, working for the Center for Planetary Health Policy. I'm a global health researcher. It's a very interesting and relevant discussion also in the global health field. We talked about BioNTech, and we know all about the vaccine distribution and how it played out. And there, actually, this tension plays out very well in the discussion that we have here, because there's a notion about investment, it's about global health security, there's a whole notion about charity, and there was not enough production in Africa, so we now need to set up new partnerships. We do this with the BioNTech vaccine developments with a company, a private company that works now together also with development cooperation to regulate actual delivery and production of those vaccines. But then there's a political economy underneath it. Where is the intellectual property? Is there really transfer of technology? Does it really build the capacities on the long term? So if you look at the devil in the details, the framing might be quite promising, but the impact, the public health interest, the public good interest might often be limited. And I would So also here, what can we learn and how can we evaluate from earlier promises on how to do things differently?
Thank you. I think there's a question there, and then we'll close it down because we're out of time.
Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. I learned a lot. My name is Mariette Kulve. I'm retired from BMZ, but I'm self-employed now. My proposal maybe to reimagine development cooperation would be more to look and do programs or policies in Europe and in Germany. So to look at Germany and Europe also as developing countries according to the Agenda 2030. And it would be I would like to know, what do you think about this idea? I mean, we do have this Agenda 2030. We do have civil society engagement and also other engagement here in Germany. So what about Germany as a development country for programs and projects? And the second short question is, you said from Botswana, you don't like the term global north and global south. I don't like it either, but do you have a better proposal? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Like I said, we're out of time, so I'm going to ask Ahuna and Bogolo to respond to this and also give their closing remarks in addition to that. So, Bogolo?
There are a lot of questions to also do closing remarks. First, Club of Rome have actually said it's Europe, US, and rest of the world. So when you listen to the current president of the Club of Rome, she does not say developing countries or global south. She will say it's the rest of the world, or you call the regions for what they are. And you call countries for what they are. And further taking it forward in Africa is there is no sub. There's no sub-Saharan. There's just Africa. There's North Africa. There's West Africa. I see you are shaking in disagreement, but I'm African, I'm telling you. There's Africa, there's North, there's West, there's East, and then there's Botswana, there's South Africa, there's, I think the less we try to polarize the continent and the rest of the world, the more we can find convergences in how we deal with Africa and the rest of the world. And so I think that is a point of departure, come to an understanding of who we're trying to relate with. It might not just be African countries, it's even the way that we deal with Latin American countries. And then for the question on health, interestingly, there's a lot of trade that's happening between Southern Africa and Germany in particular. I'll speak only on that because it's based on the APA, Economic Partnership Agreement between SACU plus Mozambique and Europe. And some of the products we export are health-related pharmaceuticals. And what we were working with the European Union and the German Embassy in Botswana was bringing some of the technology from Germany into Botswana to really build that pharmaceutical industry and then export to Germany. But what we saw as the first wind of that cooperation was a lot of export of our raw devil's claw, as an example of a product, raw devil's claw. But what that really points to, and what we were testing out as a pilot, is that there is indigenous knowledge and indigenous products in the continent that can actually help the rest, Africa and the rest of the world, if we put the right capital behind it, and if we reinvigorate the sectors with technology. Gone are the days when modern economic theory suggests that the world will self-correct, the market will self-correct. The informal sector and what was thrown or cast to the side as indigenous economy is much more relevant today in our economies than it ever needed to be. And we recognize, even in the climate action space, that it is that indigenous knowledge and indigenous products that can actually rescue the world and help to reset in achieving now the target that we seem to be failing to reach around the 1.5 degrees. And in concluding,
yes, your message to the BMZ, they're still here.
my own message to the BMZ, I have so many points. One, the global shield needs to work, and the account shouldn't just be in Germany. The account must actually, if there's part of it that's dedicated for Africa, the account should be in the continent. Why? So that the interest that is earned from that capital can be used to actually work on efficient emergency response systems. And also what we need to see around green hydrogen. I know that there was a meeting with the Chancellor and President Geingob earlier. What we actually need to hear around the global gateway and green hydrogen is an effective financing mechanism to energy in the continent that will ensure that the continent is self-sufficient and can export to Europe. Not that it's just exporting to Germany, production is for export to Germany. And then lastly, is we have to ensure that there are gender imperatives very well defined in ODA and in investment that is supported by national governments and DFIs. Thanks.
Thank you. So, I actually want to agree with my sister there from BMZ before on this concept of development cooperation as being universal, rather than, one part of the world is saving another. And I think this was the essence of the Sustainable Development Goals, that these are universal goals. They're not only needed in Burkina Faso, they are also needed in Sweden. And I think that starts to equalize a little bit. There are different degrees of transformation and development that countries are facing. But if you bring in the lens of climate change, if you bring in the lens of global insecurity, if you bring in the lens of migration and all of the things that are happening, if you bring in the lens of democracy, which is under stress everywhere in the world, not just in African countries, you start to level that playing field and you really start to talk about cooperation. And what then underpins that is that you also, the so-called global north, also learns to listen to other countries not like it with an open heart, that they could actually also learn something that could contribute to enriching their own processes. So imagine, talk about reimagining development cooperation, that you could have a group from Rwanda or Botswana deployed to Germany to support Germany in a certain area of need that the country has. That is development cooperation reimagined, rather than just assuming that it's one directional. Identify where your needs are. That could be filled by some of the people that you have always not necessarily expected something good to come out of, but there are good things that are happening. There are lessons, there are rich values that could also be exported to so-called affluent and advanced countries to enrich the lives of the people, to diminish the space of depression, of mental health is a chronicle issue in affluent societies. Where is the help? Where could it come from? Could it come from countries in the so-called global south? I've just come from the G77 meeting that was held in Kampala. And I can tell you that that part of the world is increasingly asserting itself as equal members of the international community that also can contribute to shaping the future, whether it's the future in terms of digital. You know, this is whole high-tech stuff now that we think is going to disrupt us. Who's going to make the rules? So they're not anymore accepting that the rules have to come from certain countries and they will be expected to just implement or be subjected to it. They want to be a voice at that table. And I think that's what's going to save our world, is incorporating in a serious and meaningful way the voices of these countries that have until now been treated as a subject of our so-called international system. So I think this conversation is so topical. I just want to maybe finish with a word on the security. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Sahel region. And I've just been there. We've had 4 or 5 coups, the so-called unconstitutional changes in government, which is a reflection of people's disaffection around democracy and its lack of dividends in their lives. And does security matter? It matters. But the secularization of interventions, which has been really the case in the Sahel, where all the investments and engagement is driven by a security lens. We can see that hasn't worked. And that you need to front-load development as a preventive mechanism. The reason why people are disaffected, their needs aren't being met. The services are not being extended where it matters. So we create fertile ground for the incubation of violence at its most extreme nature. So as a development organization, we are looking at how to bring development to people who have, there are people in our community who have not been touched by development. And when I say this, there are no schools for the kids. Food insecurity, people cannot eat even once a day. There is no health facility. All of these, we need to close those gaps if we want a more secure world. Not just to deploy military machinery as a form of prevention of insecurity. That hasn't worked and it's never going to work anywhere. Thank you.
Message to the BMZ.
I thought the message was there.
They're taking notes.
I think the last message is we still need international cooperation. We need even development cooperation. But development entities have to reclaim the space. It is eroding, and in its place, we're getting a lot of security-minded approaches. We're getting a lot of transactional processes. And my message will be fight the transactional nature of development. It cannot be transactional. It has to be transformational. It cannot be, I will cooperate with you if you happen to advance my agenda. Yes, national interest will always be there. No, don't get me wrong. I think we're not fooling ourselves that anything is done without national interest. But if we're talking about cooperation at an international level, let us fight, and in the development space, let us fight this sense that, it's about values that align, but not understanding the values of the other. So there are superior values. We have our values, and if you agree with us, we can do business with you. But there is no attempt to understand if the other side actually has values that they're connected with, and perhaps those values are meeting. So it's this fronting of my values are the only ones that matter, and not understanding the other and their values as well and their intentions. So I think we need to decouple this and make development less transactional, more transformational. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, a round of applause for the three of them, also for bringing in absentia. So we're massively over time, so I'm not going to do any long summary of what's been said. We plan to have a policy brief of some kind with the key points published in the next few weeks. But before we close, I want to give a vote of thanks to the teams, the different teams that made today possible. First of all, to the BMZ, I want to thank Karen Funt. I want to thank Ruth Muller for their support and their work with us on this and making sure that this happened. And also making sure that APRI gets funded, but that's sort of by the way. Thank you very much. Please give them a round of applause. I also want to thank the Bosch Foundation, Henry Altaka, for being here. Thank you so much. Dina Fakusa for working with us on this. And where's Leila? Yeah, thank you so much. And Zhao was here. Yeah, thank you so much for organizing all of this with us. Thanks for this massive and beautiful building. We are booking it already for next year. Thank you so much. And last but not the least, I want to thank my team at APRI. We've been pulling long, long days. Thank you so much, Sewa. Thanks, Chidoze, Ada, Hannah, Stephen, everyone. Thanks a lot for making today possible. This is just the first in the series. You'll be hearing from us before the end of the year about the next one. And we're looking forward to having you there as well. The conversation continues there and there over refreshments. The distinguished panelists are still here. You can still talk to them. I know you have questions. We didn't have the time to go into more. But thank you so much, and we'll continue at the refreshments. Thank you.